Joining us is Patrick Shannon, CEO of TrustPoint.
Hi, Catherine. How are you?
I'm great. Thank you. Looking forward to hearing more. What's the problem you're trying to solve?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So TrustPoint is out solving a host of different problems, but all related to localization. Localization from the standpoint of GPS. So GNSS services, Global Navigation Satellite Services, what we know primarily is GPS in the United States, but as well, better known globally as GNSS. And some of those problems, we can get into them, but they're mainly due to accuracy and availability, reliability. And the major thing that people see today within that problem set is getting to those performance metrics so that they can do very autonomous things very, very reliably and very safely.
And so elaborate more on why the current GPS standards have issues and limitations such as backward compatibility.
Yeah, absolutely. So, if folks have been following GPS, obviously it really got its start back in the 70s, and even before with some of the localization technologies the U.S. government used globally for warfighting before that. Didn't really be a commercial thing until the 90s. And as you can imagine, the technologies are old. When the GPS system was initially designed and the other kind of nationally owned systems were designed, they were designed with two things in mind. Space is expensive, primarily the realm of government. And on top of that, the user equipment on the ground, the receivers were very, I almost want to say archaic at this point, but they were cutting edge then. And they didn't have a lot of processing power, low flops, as it were. And so they built a system that was designed to meet those two major space is expensive and we have very low processing on the ground. And then they went and they deployed their systems. And those systems have proliferated fantastically. I mean, there are billions of devices sold today with GPS and GNSS. I'd actually challenge folks to come up with a piece of electronics that doesn't have a GPS receiver in it. I think of maybe a TV at this point, but besides that, almost everything else does. And so it's proliferated well. However, that backwards compatibility that you just mentioned is huge. As they update the system, they have deployed users, billions of devices, and they can't just drop those tomorrow. Not only would it be devastating to the economy, but from the standpoint of people are in the process of developing new applications based on these heritage GPS systems. And so it would hurt the future, not just today. So that's a major one, backwards compatibility. Now that backwards compatibility is actually a limitation on the ability to innovate with these heritage systems. They have to make the new generations work with the old user equipment. And that's a good thing, but also a great opportunity from the standpoint of, hey, if we had a clean slate, what would we do differently today? And that's what TrustPoint's really focused on.
So can you go into more depth on GNSS and your special sauce that makes your proprietary and blended approach superior?
Yeah, absolutely. So, we're talking about the backwards compatibility. Again, it's related to what they had on processing, what they had for spacecraft. There are two parts to the TrustPoint kind of innovation and change to GNSS. The first part is leveraging low-cost satellite. Now, this is the space track. So folks have been hearing about low-cost satellites for a little while now, and folks are very familiar now in the industry with CubeSats and microsats. And that's step one, being able to leverage new commercial technologies in space. Just from the standpoint of cost, a single PS Block 3 spacecraft runs about $500 million to be built and delivered on orbit. And from the standpoint of a microsatellite, you're talking hundreds of thousands. And the constellation architecture is different. We need many more spacecraft, but total cost for that system is well below a single GPS satellite. So that's pretty key. So low cost equipment there. And that just doesn't go for the spacecraft. It goes for the payload as well. The GPS payloads are out in medium Earth orbit, tens of thousands of kilometers away for the most part. And makes the payload very sophisticated. It has to handle heavy radiation. It's got to be able to broadcast a signal that's strong enough to reach Earth in a meaningful way. When you use commercial equipment in low Earth orbit, you can sidestep some of that stuff and broadcast louder signals, regulatory dependent, but you can get louder closer to the Earth. And so that's the first part of our kind of solution, that's innovation upon what exists today. The second part, more of the secret sauce, really has to do with digital signal processing. This has to do with innovations on the transmit and the receive side of a GPS-like signal. Again, backwards compatibility means that the existing GPS signals are based on concepts and ideas out of the 70s and 80s, initially deployed commercially in the 90s. And even today, with the new signals coming on from the US system, L5, a majority of that design work came out of the early 2000s. So the new signal is almost 20 years old. And that's worth noting. So what are we doing? Well, we're taking a clean slate approach. We have massively more computational power and flexibility for our payloads. Same in the user equipment. If you just think about the complexity of a 5G network and some of the silicon that exists to handle communications, and just look at that and go, okay, that compared to what a GPS spread spectrum signal might look like, which is simple. A 5 to 20 megahertz chipped type signal is very simple compared to a 5G protocol. And the flexibility that comes into. So we can leverage those technologies. And then we have some core features that go into our links. Part of the signal processing on the ground, signal generation on orbit. And I won't disclose all of those because we're still in the patenting process. But the idea is that we can do things with a single signal that were unthinkable 5, 10, 20 years ago for sure. And those things are very valuable to a four-dimensional triangulation problem that GPS is.
Pretty interesting stuff. But right now, GPS is a public good that hardware manufacturers take advantage of to create products. How will TrustPoint change or challenge that model?
Yeah, I think there's two parts to it. There's both a challenge and a go along with the status quo, right? So we've gotten a question in some of the investor discussions we've had over the past year. Well, how do you compete with a free service? And in reality, like you alluded to, it's not free. You pay for the hardware to access the free government service. And that hardware is being paid commercial companies. We're intending to do the same thing. Our devices, we will have, and there's a few different business models we have in mind. The low end is to add a fabless IC company. The smallest kind of bite of the pie. And we'd be licensing firmware, and that firmware would have the technology required to access and utilize our signals from space. So if we're doing our own satellites and we're transmitting our own signals, companies that are already building GPS chips, Qualcomm, Broadcom, Microchip, TomTom, Garmin, these companies would license our firmware, and then their chips would be TrustPoint enabled with the right RF front end to be able to access it. In that regard, from the user perspective, the business model is no different. They're still just going to those same old companies, buying a new receiver. That receiver just happens to also receive TrustPoint signals. And that's standard. If you go back 10 years, most receivers that you would buy in the US would access one channel of GPS, L1 as they call it. Nowadays, you can access L1 plus parts of L2, and you'll soon be able to buy GPS receivers that access L1, L2, and L5. Now, L2 you don't access fully because it's encrypted. It's the very side of things. But getting a new generation of receivers that accesses new signals is kind of standard. Actually, the latest iPhone was the first time that a phone in the United States was released that accesses multi-systems. So it accesses GPS as well as Galileo, which is the European owned and operated system. And so, yeah, now that's one business model. The other one, we are innovating on, which is the idea of having a service that's kind of a subscription base. That would be for higher end users. And the idea is that we would beef up the encryption that they would be, have access and be able to utilize. It would require kind of a secondary link, whether that's 5G, a Wi-Fi signal, periodic hookup to a hard line, whatever it is. But there'd be symmetric encryption that would be available there at a higher level that we could deploy for our standard devices. And those encryption schemes could be unique based on geographic regions around the world so that we could segment markets or provide specific military applications, specific secure specs in the field of operations.
You touched on chip manufacturers such as Qualcomm or Broadcom. What motivates them to work with TrustPoint?
Yeah. So right now, they're all kind of working solo. They'll buy, bits of IP from different companies that come up with ideas that improve GNSS receivers as they are. Motivating them to work with us really comes down to the fact that we will have a unique offering. They can already today, there's kind of a fairness in the market in regards to anyone can go get Galileo ICD and the GPS ICD and the Beidou and GLONASS ICD and access those signals, right? It's not a difficult thing to go do. Any company can go find a way to access that. So you're on an even playing ground with the signals you access. We're showing up and we're adding a new signal, and it's, in their regard, it's payday. And so what's going to happen is they're going to say, okay, we want that fifth system, TrustPoint, which is unique in its system architecture, but we want that. We're going to pay to participate with TrustPoint, and that's going to give us a leg up. So Qualcomm comes, they buy in, all of a sudden Broadcom's, a step or two behind. Likewise, TomTom comes in and says, hey, we want to be a part of this. Oh, well, Garmin's now a step behind. So it's really about a competitive edge. Got
it. So tell us some of your key milestones so far.
Yeah, absolutely. So the technology has been in development for a couple of years. The company was formally founded last summer. So that was the first big one, getting an entity in place, getting the IP rolled into it, starting to build a team around it. Next big one is closing our financing. We've been out raising equity for a couple of months now. We're very close. We're probably about maybe a month away from closing our round, which is great. It's been a great experience, gotten a lot of good feedback, really grown our network. So that's the big one. Later this year is kind of the first post-funding technical milestone that we're pursuing with our seed financing. And that's going to be to do some field demonstrations of some of our core signal processing technology. We've got some of it working in the lab right now. We're going to advance some of that, and then we're going to try to get it out into a realistic RF environment. Anyone in the communication knows stuff works really well in a lab. Put it out in the field, not so great sometimes. And so our goal is by the end of this calendar year is to do some field demonstrations and show representative performance. After that, roughly 12 months later, we get our first satellite on orbit. Both me and my partner in crime, Krista May, have a lot of experience in microsat deployments and missions. And, that would be a big one because when you do a field demo here on Earth, you can test and verify certain things in a GPS system. But it's not until you get on orbit with material things like Doppler, ionospheric effects, lack of complete knowledge of where the spacecraft is, things like that are material to our localization service that we'd want to test out. So end of 2022, that would be we'd satellite on orbit, and we'd be doing orbital demonstrations. And so that's the next one. And then after that, it's all about constellation build out. And we have two phases there that are worth talking about. The first one is probably about a 24-month phase. And that's where we build out an augmentation constellation, somewhere between 50 and maybe 70 payloads on orbit. And that wouldn't be a fully independent localization solution, but it would give a user on the ground access to additional signals. And if they combine those with GPS or combine them with Galileo, they'd have a 4-dimensional position and time solution, plus a bunch of added benefits from the TrustPoint system, a little more security, a little more reliability, a little faster time to first fix, that type of thing. That would be like a 2-year time frame. Possibly bleeding into the 3rd year after, and then after that, it's just the full constellation build out. And that's probably from today, it's probably a 6 or 7 year goal. But provide a constellation that gives a fully independent from GPS and Galileo localization solution, pole to pole, North Pole to South Pole, everywhere. So
fantastic. You were talking about your current round. Is there any more you can share with us about that?
Yeah, we're raising a seed round. We've already gotten a couple of term sheets in. We're pretty happy with the terms we got. We're zeroing in on our preferred lead. I was a little oversubscribed, so we're actually keeping the door open for some notes following. And the idea there was we have a few activities we would be kind of standardly postponing until the A round. But it would be beneficial if there's a little more money in the door to start early. Grow the team a little faster. Pursue some of the regulatory activities a little faster, and then the productization side as well. So we'd be probably, notionally in a couple of months going back out saying, okay, we've finalized those plans, activity, and then working on some notes, kind of midsummer to late summer close. So fantastic.
So tell us a bit about what keeps you up at night.
Great question. So I think the big thing is the regulatory environment. It's very complex. The previous panel was talking about spectrum, and that's always a challenge. Luckily, for better or worse, there's GPS bands that are known that we use today down in L-band. There's allocations above that, and there's actually quite a few other radio navigation bands that are not necessarily satellite based that folks are using, and there's heritage systems that are in the process of being retired and things like that. So there's lots of opportunity, but in the regulatory world, you don't have a lot of control. More money helps. You can get some lobbyists, you can pound the pavement a bit more, and that's good. But there's always timelines there, and those timelines can be delayed. Those timelines can get put on pause. You could have administration change in some foreign country outside the U.S. Luckily in the U.S. we're good for the next couple of years. Right. There should be stability in the administration, and that goes for the FCC. But if we are approaching an election year, you might submit an application, and during the election and post-election, you might just everything get put on hold. And I've seen that before in satellite telecom. And so keeping me up on night, not so much the success, it's just when that success would be achieved because you don't control the time frame. Yeah,
indeed. Tell us a bit about your team.
Sure. So right now we have 2 full-timers, but another 8 kind of contractors and advisors. My partner in crime, Krista May, the COO, one of the co-founders, he was actually the CTO and founder of Hawkeye 360, which is pretty well-known, Northern based RF analytics company. They've put a bunch of satellites on orbit. They got a staff, I think 60 of 70 now, raised over 100 million. So he brings a lot of experience in the venture space world to the team. And he's the COO, will be handling a lot of the day-to-day operations, team build out, the engineering core. Our advisors span the gambit, everything from folks with decades of experience in defense contracting to folks that are straight out of new space. And so, we've got quite a bit of business support there. We got folks that are members of the senior executive service on our advisory board. And then we also have some entrepreneurs that have been in specifically space telecom for a while. So one of our legal and regulatory advisors, Peter Ruderman, he's a serial entrepreneur, has founded a few telecom companies, including Helios Wire. It's an IoT company that sold EchoStar a little while ago. He's also got a few other ventures under his belt, 20 years doing legal and regulatory work in larger, more traditional aerospace. So we got quite a bit. We got some technical guys too with decades of DSP experience and GPS experience. And we're hoping a few of those guys on full time when our round closes. And then we've got a plethora of friends that have given us calls, said, "Hey, I'm ready for my next thing. Let me know when you guys are ready to hire some junior folks." So awesome. It's a great team.
That's wonderful. That's very exciting. Is there anything else you'd like to share with our listeners and investors what you're doing?
Yeah, I think the big thing is it really comes down to, this space won't be solved by a single company with a single phenomenology. TrustPoint is fully endeavoring to be a bit of a monopoly play in the commercial GNSS world. We have every intention and high promise to make that happen. But PNT, or position, navigation, and timing services, which aren't just provided from space, they're provided over hardline, they're provided with Wi-Fi type systems that are just terrestrial based. These are really critical, and a lot of innovation happening at different layers of that. You've got indoor positioning services, which is a market that doesn't quite fit satellite. And so that's something we'd be partnering with to help provide. You also just have hardline. Our networks, unfortunately, are rather insecure. Recent reports out of the US and European Union have pretty much stated if GPS or GNSS were to go down for a day, you're looking at over $1 billion of economic impact every 24 hours. So you're, grounding aircraft flights, that's the first one. Credit card transactions get put on pause until there's backup systems rolled into play. Wall Street trading will halt. High frequency trading is mainly geared around timing signals and fairness in and around the markets related to that. Communication networks, your networks go down, your satellite TV goes down. There's just a lot of things that happen. And so my big point is this is a big problem. The addressable market for TrustPoint as a commercial GNSS player is huge, billions of dollars of annual revenue potential. And that's a small portion of the market, but there's others. And I would just, kind of encourage folks to go out and look for those PNT plays or GPS-like plays. Of course, come talk to us for the satellite side, but there's others as well. And it's very important for our economy and for our society that we bolster these. And that commercial's got to be the way.
Terrific. Okay, let's open it up to our investor community to ask some questions. Please go ahead and click on the raise hand button to ask your question, and we'll bring you up on stage. And that raise hand button is over on the right side of the screen. And also, you can go ahead and take note of the fact that the startup evaluation form is in your meeting invite or in the chat window to complete for the evaluation of TrustPoint. And we do have a question. We're going to bring Florine up on stage.
Sorry, good to see you.
Hey, Florine.
Excellent job. Excellent job. Quick question. You sort of triggered it. Is there a way, in your industry, in what you do, to plan around or uncouple, the cycle of something like COVID?
When you say uncouple, what exactly are you referring to?
I mean, to turn it to your favor.
Gotcha. Yeah.
Catch wind.
Sure. I think there's a couple of things. I mean, the easiest thing for any entrepreneur in today's day and age is we have access, to better remote work tools and greater access to investor and customer communities because everyone's kind of better at adopting that remote engagement method. I mean, even now during this virtual conference, right? And so from that standpoint, a thing like COVID, we're able to access talent and bring folks on board that maybe we wouldn't have been comfortable doing because maybe they couldn't relocate to one of our centers. And so that's a big thing, that we're leveraging from that standpoint. It's just the learning curve that folks have gone through. There's also, if you look at vaccine distribution and tracking those assets, IoT plays a huge role in that, being able to get that kind of feedback loop to the centralized dispatcher. But there's also importance here with regards to what's the data that they're filtering back to that centralized planning control. And from the standpoint of GPS tracking of deliveries, this is huge. And that's actually one of the bigger problem sets within GPS is truckers who like to use these things called personal privacy devices. And they're kind of personal GPS jammers. And it lets them take a nap on the side of the road along lunch. Usually nothing that's really intended to be adversarial, detrimental. But it means that people around them are also jammed. And so if there's a vaccine truck that's taking a short break at a rest stop and someone else delivering TVs to Best Buy decides to turn on their personal privacy device, we'll lose track of that vaccination delivery. And being able to provide services that can break through that denied environment would be very important. I also think that there's been one big aspect of the pandemic that's been super interesting, which I think regulators are really getting more on board with commercial companies and taking risk. And going in and saying, hey, the FDA was able to speed things through. Delivery services are able to speed things through. And one of the big applications that we're pursuing is drone delivery and urban air mobility, both of which have aviation platforms that need much higher precision GPS, much more reliable GPS to proliferate. And the ability to say, hey, let's go back, let's look at what happened during this pandemic. Let's presume there's going to be something more in the future. If we could deliver vaccines with drones, perhaps that would speed things up. Let's use that as a test case to say, okay, let's provide higher GNSS services to drone companies. Drone companies provide that vaccination service perhaps faster, and it would just improve life for us and improve the return to the standard norms. So something like that, perhaps.
Oh, makes total sense. Absolutely, you should make full advantage, in my opinion. And a related one, more technical, closer to what's coming, and I guess on behalf of the wider community, can you give us the full picture, maybe the ballpark, if you cannot or don't want to speak at this time about the numbers, the current raise plus the coming nodes plus the coming A. So what would be the ballpark of the raises and the valuation?
Sure. Yeah. So it's I have to be a little careful about what I share, just because I don't want to violate the trust of the companies that we're talking to, the firms we're talking to. But I'll talk to a little bit about that. We are raising a Series Seed preferred, and with that preferred, it's a little higher than kind of your standard seed might expect for a company of our maturity, which is good. I can talk more about the notes because I think that's a little more defined. We're seeing across the industry. Companies, especially coming out of Y Combinator and elsewhere, and we're not Y Combinator, but I've sat in on a few of their pitches recently, getting great subscription to their seed rounds. And there's an encouragement both from the investor community and from the entrepreneurs to do a quick round of notes within 6 months on the order of $1 to $1.5 million. And that 1 to 1.5 essentially extends their runway maybe 6 to 9 months, super just some of the activities that they would have done in their A round. And that would be the standard that I would follow, seeing other companies go off and do that now. And so that's an easier one to talk about. Although if folks are interested, please reach out. Maybe in a week or so, I might be able to share more. But that's about as far as I can go at the moment.
Cool. And I promise the last one.
Sure.
It's simple and related. In terms of use of funds, any quick breakdown?
Yeah, absolutely. So, about 2/3 of our funding is going towards labor, getting some folks on board to do the work. That's an easy one. Now, the work that they're going to be doing in the equipment and facilities that go into that has to do with our field demonstration. So our technology exists in simulation and a little bit of hardware right now. We want to bolster the maturity of that hardware and those simulations. So it's a lot of computers, it's a lot of dev kits, a lot of radios, those types of things. But the end state of that is the field demonstration, which looks like a handful of transmitters and 1 or 2 prototype receivers. That equipment is the equipment being tested. That would be tested out in the field somewhere in some sort of 2-dimensional test, or preferably, and if we have time and the weather does well for us when we choose to go out and we do the inverted localization test, which they've done in the past for GPS. This is how they tested GPS originally. And you put the transmitters on the ground, and then you fly an aircraft, or in our case, it could be a drone, in the air above them. And that's the receiver. And that inverted solution essentially lets you track data at the top. Then we use some very high fidelity GPS receivers, so standard GPS receivers, as ground truth for those 5 points. And you'd post-process the GPS receivers to get really high fidelity data. It'll take a couple days to do that. But that whole test involves drone test companies, RF test ranges, certain regulatory. And so our seed funding is all going towards getting through that field demonstration. There's business development and regulatory as well, but that's more of a, one person working full time, pushing both of those, trying to get some LOIs, more formal LOIs in the door ahead of an A round, and build relationships with the government agencies we're going to need for the A round.
Always important. Cool.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Well, thank you both. And Patrick, thank you so much. It was a super interesting conversation. Really appreciate it. Thanks so much.
Thank you.